We have around 15.
Okay, perfect. So let's start off. Hi Umar, but I will not be able to see the names of the participants from the screen I have. So I will not know who is attended, who is not attended. But I'm assuming that people are coming in and they're joining, and we'll have the attendance sheet at the end of the
Of
webinar.
course, Gautam. Yes, everyone is will have the number of attendees and everything. You can start. Everyone on the call can hear you right away. So go ahead.
Perfect. So hi, good morning, partners. Good morning. I know there are some Schneider people also. So good morning, team. I'm Gautam, and I look after the digital power portfolio for the Gulf cluster. I'm based in the Dubai office, and today we are going to talk about the new range of the capacitor banks, which we have launched in the last few months to replace our older capacitor bank range. Right. So I know there has been a lot of requirements, a lot of expectations from our partners, from our customers on the way we used to make our capacitor banks. And we hope that with this new version, we will be able to address most of those expectations, most of those requirements, and we'll be able to fulfill the customer expectations, the technical requirements, and the needs through our capacitor banks, right? So the range of the capacitor banks does not change. They were called as PowerLogic capacitor banks. They're still called as PowerLogic capacitor banks. They were the VarSet range. They're still the VarSet range, and they're still made in India in our factory. The intent of this new range of capacitor bank was to bring in a lot more standardization than we had earlier. Now, the Bangalore factory where these capacitor banks are made caters to various regions and various countries in the Southeast Asia, in East Asia, and Pacific region, including and the Gulf region. And everyone had a different design, different platform. So with this platform, we're trying to bring it together. We're trying to harmonize and bring them to common platform. This helps us in reducing the time to market. This helps us in reducing our costs also, and this helps us in achieving a standardized design for our capacitor banks. Right now, the major aspects of the capacitor banks do not change as you would have seen in the earlier ranges. We still have the breakers at the main incomer for the isolation of switching on and off of capacitor banks. We still have a step protection with breakers and with TVSS. We still have reactors in all of our capacitor banks. Now, depending upon which version of capacitor bank we are taking, the ratings of the reactors will change. The capacitors will remain our PowerLogic range of capacitors. We still will not use the Easy Logic range of capacitors. We still use the PowerLogic range of capacitors. However, with this range, now we do have an option of adding additional components inside the capacitor bank, right? Which we'll see later. This capacitor bank continues to use the PowerLogic controller, the VPL series, and this capacitor bank continues to use the thermostats and the fan control logics, which are required for the protection and safety of the capacitor banks themselves. Right. The key value propositions of this capacitor bank is, in addition to being efficient as compared to the early capacitor banks, we're bringing you a much more robust enclosure. Now we have the IP42 rated enclosure as compared to the IP31 and IP20 enclosures earlier. The capacitor banks are now type tested to 50 degrees ambient, unlike earlier where in some versions were 40 and some versions were 50. They are all type tested as for the ISO 61349 and ISO 61921. And the designs, what we have used for these capacitor banks, are compliant to the requirements of the utilities in Dubai, the utilities in Abu Dhabi, and the utilities in Kuwait, for that matter. There's a lot of focus on safety and protection of the capacitor banks. So you'll see that there's a lot of components here which are used to ensure that the capacitor banks remain safe and are able to protect themselves against temperature rises or against disconnection or against any other thing which happens in the capacitor banks. Right now, when you talk about these capacitor banks, there is now an option to connect the capacitor banks to a central monitoring system to get the connectivity and to get the status and the performance of the capacitor banks for every capacitor bank which is connected in the central system. There is also a possibility to add climatic sensors into the capacitor banks or the environmental sensors into the capacitor banks so that we can get the understanding of how's the temperatures and how's the humidity inside the capacitor banks, which can be connected to a gateway, and the gateway can then be connected to the central monitoring system. We have seen in the past that there were some requirements for some projects of having a smoke detector inside the capacitor bank from the customer's perspective, right? So now we're giving the formal option of adding smoke detectors inside the capacitor banks in case of unintended thermal events. Now, don't get this otherwise. The capacitor banks are fully capable of switching themselves off and turning themselves off if the temperature rises happen, and turning the fans on when the temperatures rise up to ensure that there's enough circulation. But this adds an added layer of protection for the capacitor bank in case there's a smoke detected inside the capacitor bank. And this is a purely additional feature. This does not become part of a standard capacitor bank as such. Right. Now, when we talk about the capacitor banks, as I said, that they are fully type tested by ASTA. They have an IP42 protected rated enclosure with a 50-degree ambient type tested design. Now, this 50 degrees is without any D rating. Right. So this gives us a very, very robust presence in the market. And then there are multiple safety features. For example, of course, we do have the shrouding in front of the capacitor banks as a default. Earlier, it was an option, but now it has become a default. There are door limit switches, which ensures that if somebody accidentally opens the door, the capacitor bank goes into an off mode, and then there are enough interlocks on the main incomer side. Also, when you talk about overheating, there are enough protections inside the capacitor bank. So, for example, there are thermostats at different temperature limits, which will help us regulate the ventilation and which will help us regulate the operation of the capacitor bank itself, depending upon what the thresholds have been set. There is also a thermal sensor, which is embedded inside the power factor controller, the VPL, which is there. So there also there is a temperature sensor, which will help us in connecting or disconnecting the capacitor bank in case there's a very heavy temperature rise seen or detected by this temperature sensor. The reactors have an embedded thermal sensor again, or thermal contact again, which ensures that that step, if any abnormal overheating happens, that step gets disconnected and thus prevents any overheating inside the capacitor bank. Additional features like smoke detector is already there. And then, as I mentioned, that there are environmental sensors, the CL110, which are there, which can be provided on a request if the need be by the clients. Okay. Now, we had an old range and we had a new range. So I thought it to make it to present it in a very clear manner on what is the old range and what is the new range and how the differences would be. We had three main designs earlier. We have three main designs now also. However, there's a difference in the ratings and there's difference in the sizes of the capacitor bank. You'll see here. So earlier we had three sizes. We had different ratings and three sizes for different ratings. For example, for Abu Dhabi or for Kuwait, we had a different size of the capacitor banks. For Abu Dhabi, from 50 to 150, we had one size. From 175 to 300, okay, it was another size. And then 325 to 500, we had another size. For Kuwait, from 50 to 150, we had one size of the capacitor bank. 175 to 375, we have another size of the capacitor bank. And from 400 to 500, we had a bigger size of the capacitor bank. And the ratings which are available were available from 75 to 500 kVR. I'm sorry, there's a bit error here. It should not be 50, it should be 75. So we had from 75 to 500 kVR as availability of the ratings. Also, when we talk about the ratings, there was a minimum step size and there was a maximum step size. So with the minimum step size for most of our capacitor banks used to be 50 kVR earlier. Now that step size is changing, and it's now for most of the times it's going to be either 12.5 25 kVR as a step size. In the new design, we are limiting our sizes to only two sizes or two frame sizes. And for all the three utilities or three utilities, it's going to be available from 50 to 500 kVR rated. So the frame sizes for Dubai will be divided between 50 to 200 will be one frame size as given here, and 225 to 500 kVR is the other frame size which are given here. For Abu Dhabi, it will be from 50 to 275, and then 300 to 500 kVR will be the two ranges, or two batches or two lots. For Kuwait also, we're going to have two frame sizes from 50 to 275, and then 300 to 500 kVR will be two different sizes. The capacitor banks are available in both top and bottom entries here, except for the Kuwait capacitor banks, which are only available in bottom entry. But the best part is, if earlier, if you would have seen, to change the capacitor bank entry from bottom to top or top to bottom was a very tedious task. You have to change the cable orientation, you have to put a separate cable compartment, and then draw the cables and pull the cables to wherever the entry was to make it compatible with the alternative, with the opposite cable entry. But in this case now, changing the cable entry orientation is very, very simple. And if you have ordered, let's say, a bottom entry capacitor bank and the requirement was for a top entry, it is very easy to change the orientation of the breaker and make it a top entry instead of a bottom entry. It's not very complicated, it's simple, it's easy to do, and it's very quick activity also. You can easily add smoke detectors, environmental sensors, gateways inside the new version of the capacitor banks. They come as bricks, and we can add these bricks into the capacitor banks. The old capacitor banks were all IP31, and they were all rear access capacitor banks. Now, this version, the new versions are all going to be IP42 rated, and they will have access from the front side of the capacitor banks. So now you can actually put the capacitor banks right next to the wall. You do not have to leave so much of space to allow for the access of the capacitor banks from the rear side. They're all accessible from the front side. Now, there's a reason why we say that there's a side access on these capacitor banks. This is because you've got reactors in the capacitor banks. Now, to access the reactors, if you have to change, or you have to do some wiring change on the reactors, that's the only time when you'll have to open the side panel of the capacitor bank. Otherwise, for capacitors, and you have to do any simple maintenance, it's all doable, it's all accessible from the front side of the capacitor bank out here. Right now, from the disconnector, from the main breaker side, it all remains same as it was earlier. For Diva, we do have switch disconnector at the main incomer, and then we have got compact NSX at the step protection. For Abu Dhabi, we have got switch disconnector at the main incomer, and we've got fuse and overlay protection at the cap stages at every step. And for the Kuwait one, we do have a circuit breaker at the main incomer, and then we've got the NSX or the breakers at every stage or every step for protection. All the capacitor banks do come in the same standard color, RAL 7035. They are up to 50 degrees. They are IK10, and they're type tested as well, 61921 and 61349 standards as such. When we look at the old and the new, visibly, there is a difference. So when you see the old one, they used to be appearing like this, with the ventilations on the side and on the top. Whereas when we talk about the new capacitor banks, the ventilations are on the front side. And there's, of course, the top ventilation canopy also available. But then in the high ratings, if you see, there is a separate door to access the breaker and the controller. And this is a separate door, which is to access the capacitors and the reactors side. Whereas in the earlier ones, because it was all accessible from rear, there used to be a single door, and it used to be shrouded from the front side. So this is how visibly the two ranges will look like when we talk about the appearance of the capacitor banks. When you talk about the drawings and the sizes and the side views, etc., this is how the older Abu Dhabi version used to look like, whereas the new one will look like for this. So this is the shorter version from 50 to 275 kVR. It is now only 1.2 meters high, I think, from the height perspective. Now, if you remember the older versions of Abu Dhabi, we had one common size. They were all 2.1 meters long. They were all 800 meters wide, right? And this is where we bring in a small differentiation. The 275 rated or lower capacitor banks are now shorter in size, and the layout has been again made in a very simple manner so that you can access it from the front sides. And for Diva also, we are making the same arrangement wherein the capacitor banks are of shorter size and they're all accessible from the front size. However, when you talk about the high ratings up to 500 kVAs, they are going to be high or long capacitor banks with the ventilations or the air inlets in the front sides, and then you've got a top exhaust for the ears, and then this is how the capacitor banks will look like from the back side, and this is how they look from the side view. Side. We have all the drawings, we have all the technical details ready with us to share if required. We can do that. Just let us know what you want, and then we can share them with you. For every capacitor bank rating, there is a standard reference. So if you want a 50 kVAR capacitor bank, there's a reference for that. If you want a 75 rated capacitor bank, there's a reference for that. And if you want a bottom entry, there's a separate reference. If you want a top entry, there's a separate reference. So from 50 to 500 in the steps of 25 kVAR, we have got so many capacitor bank ratings. We've got so many references, each for bottom entry and each for top entry, except for the ones which are available for Kuwait, where we only have a bottom entry capacitor banks. Right now, in a tabular form, this just gives us some of the features which are different in the new range of capacitor banks as compared to the older ranges of capacitor banks. So if you see here, the major difference comes in the temperature, it comes in the IP rating, and it comes in the availability of the covers in the front, which are now available as default and not as an option in the capacitor banks. The rest of the ratings, the rest of the features remain same. The thermostats, the indoor-outdoor mounting, and then the enclosure color. Earlier it was 7035. Now also it is 7035. However, from the ratings perspective, as I said earlier, it was available from 75 to 500. Now these are available from 50 to 500. From Abu Dhabi's perspective, the ratings from 50 to 275 have already been approved and complied to the ADQCC. We do have the certificates for the new range, and that is what we have started to supply in the market. We have not taken the approval for the higher range, which is 300 to 500, because we are still waiting for some technical clarifications and technical compliances to be completed at the factory level. Once that is done, then we'll approach ADQCC and the Abu Dhabi utility for the approval of the high ratings. But for DIVA or for Dubai utilities, we have now the complete range from 50 to 500 available in the new range, and we have stopped the older range from supplying. The factory has also stopped manufacturing the older versions of these cap banks as a standard practice. Right, so it's only the new ranges which are available for Dubai. The same capacitor banks. Now, whether these are as per the Dubai design or Abu Dhabi design or Kuwait design, the same capacitor banks are available for the markets in Oman and in Qatar. We have seen capacitor banks being supplied in Oman, whether sometimes based upon the ratings and based upon the technical specs, sometimes they take the Dubai design. Sometimes they take the Kuwait design. Again, it depends upon what kind of requirements they have. But these capacitor banks are open for these markets. For Qatar, most of the times we have seen the capacitor banks being taken from France if they're taking the assembled cap banks. But now with these capacitor banks available, I would encourage the partners to explore if they can start using this new version of the capacitor banks for their projects, right? Some other differences among the new range and the old range is among the colors of the cables. there were a big feedback that all the cables which are coming in our capacitor banks are all black in color, which creates a lot of confusion and a lot of non-compliance with some of the utilities. So now we have made all the cables as RYB colored so that it is easy for identification. There are limit switches on the front and the back panels, so which was not the case earlier. So now these have also been made as a default feature for all our capacitor banks. And as I said earlier, the access is now front access for all our capacitor banks, whereas earlier it was only a rear access for our capacitor banks. And the fans are also now on the front side, and earlier they were on the right and the left side. So when the fans are on the front side, it also helps us put the capacitor banks a bit more closer to the other installations in the electrical room. Earlier, we had to leave a bit of a space for the fans to operate and for the air to circulate and to vent out. But now with the fans on the front side, it helps us put the save a little bit of space and put them a bit more closer to the other installations than we were doing it earlier. Right. So these are the major differences, and these are the major features of the new capacitor banks. As such, the new capacitor banks are all available to offer, to propose, to sell, to deliver for our customers. The factory has started to manufacture them. We have started to deliver the capacitor banks to our customers based upon what orders have been booked. Just a bit of a caution on the Abu Dhabi side, where the new range is still not available from 300 to 500 kVR because it is still not been submitted for approval by to ADQCC. Once we do that, we will of course come back to you and will confirm to you that the new range is available to sell, and then we'll slowly transition to the new range from the old range of the Abu Dhabi capacitor banks. But otherwise, all of them are available to sell. Another big feedback which we had received in the last few years was on the lead time of our capacitor banks, wherein we saw the lead times going from 3 months to 6 months to sometimes 8 months also. Right now, with the help of this new design, which is standardizing a lot of things, which is making uniform a lot of things among the various capacitor banks which are being manufactured in the factory, we aim to cut down the lead time from, let's say, 8 months or 6 months to 10 weeks of delivery at our RDC. In the ideal scenario, we are asking the factory to dispatch the capacitor banks within 4 to 6 weeks of receiving the order, which means that if everything works well, we should receive the capacitor banks in our RDC within 8 to 10 weeks of the order placement. And that is a big, big reduction in the lead time compared to the earlier experiences, which we have all seen for our capacitor banks. Now, I'm not saying that we have reached that level, but we have seen the factory dispatching the capacitor banks much quicker now as compared to the earlier lead times. We are not at the 4-week level yet, but we have definitely reduced the capacitor bank lead time to about 2 months or 3 months as compared to the 6 to 8 months, which was seen earlier. So that's a big reduction which we've seen already, and we aim to reduce it to even more, to about 8 to 10 weeks at our RDC in the coming 1 or 2 months. We are working with the factory, we are working with our manufacturing processes, we are working with you, we are working with our sales team to ensure that we do give this lead time to our customers when everything is set. Yep. So this is all about our new capacitor banks, which are now available to sell, which are now available to offer. The pricing can be done. Everything is set in the system for you to go ahead and start proposing them. And I hope we'll be able to make good on these capacitor banks and get a lot more orders than we were doing earlier. All our sales teams are updated on these new ranges. In fact, they've started to offer these new ranges. And if you have any doubts, any more clarifications, any requirements of drawings, of technical aspects of what goes into these capacitor banks, we are all there to support you in giving you the details as and when required for your submittals, for your own understanding, for anything which is required. Yep. Thanks a lot. So I will end my very short capacitor bank offer overview here. And Omar, if we can open the floor for any questions or any feedback.
Of course, please post your questions on the chat. We have one question.
Yep.
It says, in the new design, separate door design stats from which rating?
Sorry, the separate door design, right? So these are at the higher side of the ratings. Where did it go? Wait. Yeah. So I'm assuming you're talking about this particular design. So these are high ratings which start from 275 kVR and upwards. This is my lower rating up to 275 kVR. So 275, 50 to 275 will get this capacitor bank. 300 to 500 you will get this size of the capacitor bank. I hope that answers your question. Anything else we have, Omar, on the chat, or if somebody wants to unmute and ask a question?
Yes, we have one more question that says, smoke detector.
Mm-hmm.
It's mandatory for طاقة between brackets ADDC, and it's
Okay.
not optional.
Okay. I've taken your point. See, when we have given our capacitor banks for approvals to TACA or to ADDC or to ADQCC, we had submitted them the capacitor banks without smoke detectors, but showcasing that the capacitor banks have enough detection capabilities with the help of the thermostats we have in the capacitor bank, in the reactors, and in the controller, and they have approved our capacitor banks without the smoke detectors, right? So if the need be, we can provide smoke detectors in the capacitor banks, but as of now, the standard version is without the smoke detectors. But as I said, if the need is, we can. You just tell us that you need a smoke detector, and we can start working on how to incorporate those smoke detectors in your capacitor bank.
Well, so far I don't see any other questions on the chat, but please, everyone, if you have any questions, post them. We have a
Mhm.
question that, will you share the presentation slides?
So I can share them, Omar, since you will have the
Yes.
contacts of all the participants. I will share this with you, and then you can distribute it among all the participants.
All right. Thank you very much, Gautam. And there's another question that says, for front limit switch, is there any timer for the restarting?
I don't think so that there is a timer to restart the thing. Do we have Suresh on the call? And if Suresh knows it, Suresh, I'm not sure if you can mute or unmute yourself, but if you're there, if you know the answer, can you just type it on the
So
chat? Maybe
Suresh has
Omar
already
can.
answered on the chat, and he
Okay,
says there's no timer.
okay.
I think let us wait for another couple of minutes. If there's no more questions, we can end this webinar. There is one
Yes.
question. Yes, I see now. So also for Taqa, no use for front and side access as per Taqa cap bank clearance. It should have 750 mm around all sides of cap banks. Is there a chance to keep the old design also? It's a continuation to the question.
So the lower ratings, which is up to 275, there is no chance to keep the old design because that is already gone. It was introduced a bit late last year, and the approvals we have taken is not for the old design, but the new design. But for the higher ratings, I will check with my sales team and with the factory teams if we can retain the old design and we can get the approval for both old and the new designs for the ADDC version. Okay, I will check on it. I'm not assuring anything right now, but I will check on how it can be done or if it can be done. Okay,
So
Omar,
I'm not
if
sure
we
if this is a question or
okay.
uh, a comment from one of our partners that says, "And thanks for improving delivery time, as it's much needed." So I think,
All right.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, to all our partners, to all our customers, uh, uh, I myself was involved in direct discussions with, I think, most of you, and that was one feedback which used to come every time whenever we used to talk about the capacitor banks. And yes, we are taking actions, we are taking steps, and as I said, that we have not reached the ideal stage of dispatching the capacitor banks in 4 to 6 weeks, but that is our ideal or that's where we aim to. However, we know we have reduced at least the capacitor bank to 3 months now.
So we have another question that
Mhm.
says, "What will be the lead time for the new versions of capacitor banks panels, regardless of their ratings?"
So, as of now, the lead time is about 12 weeks. However, we want to reduce it to 8 weeks going in the next 2 to 3 months. We should see about 8 weeks as a lead time, but as of now, it's about 12 weeks.
All right, I think we can go ahead and close this webinar. So thank you everyone for attending. We're very pleased to have you with us. Still, if you have more questions, you can ask them to your account managers and they will surely send them to us and we will get back to you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Omar, for moderating this session, and thanks a lot to all the partners, to all the customers who came in today and gave their time for us to present our offer of the new range of capacitor bank. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.